In a moment, I'm going to introduce you all to Samuel Gunter, who will do the legislative update. But before he does, I wanted to give you just a thought in closing as we get ready to wrap up the day. And that is that I hope everyone enjoyed themselves today. I hope everyone enjoyed the food, the venue, the nice weather we see out the window. But mostly, I hope that you learned something. And the other thing I'd really like to ask you to do is to think about the things that were said today. Think about yourself and your role. Where do you fit into the overall mosaic of affordable housing? And examine what could you do differently? What could you do better? What barriers do you have to looking at things in a different way? What can you be really creative about? Who is a partner you don't have that maybe you could go be a partner with? We have great hopes that something monumental will come from this day. And maybe it will. I'm already hearing plans for future meetings and future collaborations. And what I know is that affordable housing has been an issue in this community for a while now. And that we all want to see it better. And it can be easy for us to think of it as an intractable problem. I know sometimes I get tired, I get frustrated, and I think, oh, we're never going to do any better. But that's actually not true. You know, in my short lifetime, I've seen gay marriage become legal, which I never thought would happen. I've seen the falling of the Berlin Wall, which I didn't think would happen. So there's no reason why a bunch of committed, creative people in Western North Carolina can't solve its affordable housing problem. So that's what I want you to take away from today and to think about what is your part in doing that. So in just a moment, you're going to hear from Samuel Gunter, and he's someone I'm really happy that I know. Samuel is the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the North Carolina Housing Coalition. He lives in Durham, and he's a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin and Duke Divinity School. And I like him despite the fact he went to Duke. He has worked with the Christian Life Commission, the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, and Habitat for Humanity of Wake County. Samuel has also served churches in Texas and North Carolina and is a Peace Corps and AmeriCorps Vista alumnus. He currently serves on the board of Habitat North Carolina and the Advocacy Committee of Habitat International. After Samuel speaks, we'll do a few questions and answers, and then we'll let you all go home.
First of all, has it been a good conference for y'all so far? Yeah? Yes, last night was amazing. I was not expecting the scale of people that were going to be there. That's incredible that this community turned out that many people to hear from Matthew Desmond. So good job, y'all. So like Robin said, I am from the North Carolina Housing Coalition. I do policy and advocacy, which means I get to be the guy that wanders around the halls of the General Assembly when they're in session, sometimes when they're not in session, and occasionally make trips up to DC to wander the halls of Congress a little bit. We are a membership organization of folks around the state who produce, preserve, care about affordable housing. So before I even start talking, if that describes you, we need you as a member. nchousing.org. We need as many folks as we can to be advocates ready to speak to elected officials about the desperate need our state has for affordable housing. So nchousing.org, please join us. So policy updates. If I were to ask you in one word what you think the policy update was going to be, what word would that be? Just throw it out. Mixed, trust fund, bad, sad, what else? Nothing? Good, nothing good. Well, that's two words. That doesn't, I guess yeah. So things are moving really quickly right now, right? For those of you who've been watching the news, the framework for tax reform dropped on Wednesday. And if you've been paying attention to all of what we've been saying during this conference, the vast majority of our housing subsidy in this country comes through our tax policy. All of that is up in the air right now. As I can't remember who said it, I think a couple people have said it in workshops, the framework explicitly preserves two corporate tax breaks, and that is the low-income housing tax credit and the research and development tax credit. So the low-income housing tax credit is explicitly preserved, but it's silent on a whole lot of other things, including the mortgage interest deduction, right? But that is happening right now. The calendar as it looks, because the way they want to pass tax reform is through budget reconciliation, so they only need 51 votes in the Senate instead of 60. The House is going to pass their budget next week, the Senate the week after, and then they'll proceed with tax reform and they're hoping it's going to be revenue neutral, which allows them to do it through this mechanism. So we're going to be engaging in a lot of conversations. What was released on Wednesday was a framework. It is not policy detail, and so it's hard to know really what it means. So it's out there, but we don't really know a lot about it until we see a detailed plan on paper. With that said, right now, absolutely right now is the time to get in touch with your elected officials. And the one who represents this area, Mark Meadows, has an incredible amount of power in this process right now. As the president of the Freedom Caucus, this is a hot place for people providing input into what is needed. And in my experience dealing with Representative Meadows' office, his staff is very attentive, but only if you're a constituent, which means I don't get a lot of access unless I'm coming with someone who lives in his district. And I don't need to necessarily be in that room, but that means you need to be calling and talking. And call, do not email. Emails, not incredibly effective right now. Make a phone call. If you know someone who knows someone, leverage that relationship to get in the office and speak face to face. But Mark Meadows is going to be key in this process. So tax reform is happening right now. As we saw, the mortgage interest deduction is the largest housing subsidy we have in this country. One of the ways when I go around the state and talk about affordable housing, I get around this this seems to be a sophisticated group. We've done this, so I don't want to trick you into anything. But I'll usually start by saying, how many of you rent? How many of you own your homes? How many people, out of curiosity, live in subsidized housing? So, some folks will raise their hands for some, and then when we get to subsidized housing, I'll have one or two folks who maybe are residents of the tax credit or something like that, and no one else raises their hand. And then I ask the question again, how many of y'all own your home again? How many of you use the mortgage interest deduction? So let's ask the question again, how many of you live in subsidized housing? And then most of the hands in the room go up, right? It's important to set that framework because a lot of what you'll hear when you go into a legislative office is, we don't have enough money. So you got to pick and choose. Are we going to choose this group of poor people to help or this group of poor people to help? You make the choice. That is a false choice. Don't answer that question. That is not the real question. Because the resources are there. We just spend them on homeowners who would, as Mr. Cohen, the economic advisor for the White House, said in a press conference earlier this week, no one buys a house to get the mortgage interest deduction. It's not something that affects the market. It's not something that really affects the home ownership rate. So we're in the middle of tax reform process right now, and because that happens through budget reconciliation, we're also in the middle of the budget process right now at the federal level. And so how many of you, I don't recognize a lot of faces in the room, so how many are like affordable housing developers, use tax credits or home funding, CDBG funding? Not a lot of folks in the room. So earlier in the year, when the White House released their budget proposal, those of us who do use those sources of funding were shocked because there were a lot of zeros in that document. CDBG, gone. Home, gone. Section 4 capacity building grants, gone. Weatherization program, gone. Interagency council, an entire agency, the Interagency Council on Homelessness, gone, and on down the line. And if you walked down the budget proposal document, you would see next to each of those a phrase. This is properly the role of the state and local governments, right? Federal government, we want to get out of this business. It would have meant a huge loss. Like Robin said, I worked for Habitat for Humanity of Wake County. I sit on the board of Habitat North Carolina and Habitat International's Advocacy Committee. Every single dollar Habitat accesses was zeroed out. AmeriCorps funding. Any of you use AmeriCorps members in your work? That was an incredible thing to see. And it sort of it shocked the conscience and jarred a lot of people. But when we started doing visits with legislators on both sides of the aisle, we heard the word draconian used to describe those cuts from just about every legislator in North Carolina, Republican and Democrat. And we're split 10-3 on the congressional side, and both of our senators are Republicans. And almost every single one of them described those cuts as draconian. I say that to say the Trump proposal to zero out a lot of this affordable housing funding, I don't think is going to go anywhere. And when they passed their budget compromise, there were actually some increases on the affordable housing side. It was kind of shocking to see, especially on the housing counseling front. For any of you who receive housing counseling funding, there was a little bit of a bump. But as we are cycling in right now to this of passing a budget document to be able to move tax reform through budget reconciliation, all of that is up for question, in large part because they didn't repeal the Affordable Care Act, right? The reason that came first was they were hoping to get savings out of repealing the Affordable Care Act to be able to pass a revenue-neutral tax reform bill. But now they don't have all of that money to play with in the tax reform bill, so it is going to be harder and harder to make those numbers work on tax reform and make it revenue neutral so that they don't need 60 votes in the Senate. Is everyone thoroughly confused? Everyone follow that? All right. Any questions on that? No, they're not moot, and we still need to pass them. So Scott is talking about, on the House side, it's T-Berry Neal, 1661. And it provides some reforms, some of which allow LIHTC properties to go a little bit deeper through income averaging. It has some reforms to the program to make it work a little better. The Senate side actually expands the low-income housing tax credit by 50%. That's the Cantwell-Hatch Bill 548, I think it is. So we just passed 100 co-sponsors in the House on the House bill, and it's 50-50 Democrat-Republican. And from North Carolina, we did an amazing job in North Carolina. We have the highest rate of co-sponsors, I think only behind New York, maybe. But we've got Representative Price, Representative Holding, Representative Rouser, Representative Budd, and Representative Jones, all signed on as co-sponsors, 4 Republicans and 1 Democrat. And we've gotten some gestures of support from some others, but aren't ready to put their name on the document yet. We still need to work that bill. I still don't think Cantwell-Hatch is going to pass with the expansion. I think it's mostly going to be the reforms. But what is promising is that we have gotten assurances from the folks writing tax reform that the low-income housing tax credit is pretty secure because they're happy with how that program is functioning. There's a couple, setting a 4% rate, making that permanent, things like that. I don't know. The private activity bonds, it's silent on. So there's some other stuff that we need to see a document beyond a general framework to know the answer to. But all of that is still, I think it's on pretty firm footing right now. So that's kind of that's the big news at the federal level is tax reform. And as you heard from my brief bio, I'm a pastor. And so if you had told me when I was pastoring churches that tax reform would be the thing that I would be most concerned about, I would have told you were crazy. But that's where we're at. Yes? It's not in the framework. They don't so there have been some talks. I have had some. Oh, so he's asking about mortgage interest deduction, whether so I have heard backroom talks that they are considering limiting the mortgage interest deduction, having some reforms to the mortgage interest deduction in some ways. There's a national coalition that's trying to get them to cut the mortgage interest deduction in half and all of the savings they get from that to move over to subsidize lower income housing, right? But the framework they put forward is silent on it. And I think it's up in the air right now. I heard 2 different things from Representative Holding's office and Representative Meadows' office in the last week. No, that's right. And it's we could get really deep in the weeds on a lot of things. And this is one that it's important, but once again, because it's a framework, the details aren't there yet to know. But with increasing the standard deduction from 12,000 for a single filer and 24 for a married couple. Yeah, it makes the mortgage deduction a lot harder to use for folks at middle incomes. Yeah. Absolutely. It's I don't yeah, so I don't know where, and we've seen the trouble with giving these updates, and it has been true all this year, is that the things you hear one day are completely changed the next day, right? And we haven't yet seen any success in getting anything big. So I don't know if tax reform is a possibility at all. I thought going into after November, I thought going into this year that the only thing they could probably get done was tax reform. But the more that it has, more that time has progressed, it's become clear that when you build a world around a certain tax system, remaking the world is very difficult because you've built up an economy around a certain set of assumptions about how all this works. And so you've got people coming out of the woodwork to oppose. It's hard to make that work, even if you're only using one party to pass it. So my prospects for tax reform passing are not high. I don't think the probability is high, but I'm not going to rule it out. And so if you are one who calls, now is a great time to call. Moving down to the state level. There's more happening at the federal government. We could talk about fair housing as well. How many of you attended the fair housing workshop? So affirmatively furthering fair housing, that rule is on thin ice right now. There have been a couple of amendments that have been attached to, they attempted to attach them to past budget spending bills the last 2 years to defund the federal government's efforts to implement affirmatively furthering fair housing. They also include language that prevents the federal government from capturing any information related to race in housing. Yeah, well, if you read, and I do, a lot of conservative media have been calling this either Obama's war on the suburbs or a national zoning board. Neither of which are true, right? That's framed, but I throw that out there to say there is a base of folks that are very tuned into this issue and have given Senator Burr and Senator Tillis, who both voted those amendments down, a lot of flack for that. So also, if you're ever talking with Senator Burr and Tillis's office, you can thank them for that. But fair housing, that is something that especially affirmatively furthering fair housing, that is on the rocks right now. We don't know what's going to happen with it, so stay tuned. No, this could happen. This could happen quickly as well. So Ben Carson was quoted 2.5 weeks ago, something like that, saying we need to take a look at this. There are a number of legislators, kind of led by Cotton, Flake, Gozar, and a couple of others that have been encouraging him to just get rid of it, right? And he doesn't want to get rid of it, but he wants to change it. But as is often with Dr. Carson, the detail isn't there, so we don't know what that means yet, right? Which is a common theme. We don't know exactly what that's going to mean, especially for the folks, those of us in the room, who are practitioners, and the details matter a lot to the work that we do, right? So stepping down to the state level, we are not in a regular session right now. We're in this endless stream of special sessions at the moment. But we've had some relatively good news on the affordable housing front. And I say relatively, but relatively good news. And I was excited to see, we had several folks from y'all's delegation here. Senator Edwards was here, Senator Van Dyne was here, Representative Turner and Representative Ager were all here. Did anyone see anyone else that I missed? Oh, he did? All right. Fantastic. So once again, y'all have some very crucial folks in your delegation. Representative Ager, Senator Van Dyne, and Senator Edwards all sit on the subcommittee of appropriations that handles the Housing Trust Fund and the Workforce Housing Loan Program. So I'm in their offices a lot. I see them at committee a lot. These are key folks to be talking with about the need for affordable housing. But I want to paint a little bit of a picture. So we reached a low point in the state of North Carolina in terms of our affordable housing investment about 4 years ago. Our our state tax credit that coupled with the federal tax credit went away in this general we don't like tax credits remaking of the North Carolina system, right? That was a huge loss. It was about, the last year the state tax credit was worth about $55 million for the state of North Carolina, and they replaced it with a workforce housing loan program that was worth about $10 million. Well, not about, it was, they appropriated $10 million. So huge loss there. And our trust fund, which was started with $20 million, it bottomed out at $6.8 million for the whole state of North Carolina. And if you've been paying attention to the numbers it takes to make any of this stuff work, $6.8 million is, I mean, you passed a $25 million housing bond just for Asheville. We had $75 million on the ballot in local communities in North Carolina, 25 here, 25 in Greensboro, 20 in Charlotte, another 5 in Orange County. All of them passed, all of them with more than 68% of the vote. And $6.8 million for the whole state of North Carolina. It's not enough. But the good news is we've seen that creep up. So we bottomed out 4 years ago, but we've seen steady increase. Our workforce housing loan program went from 10 to 12.5 and then to 20, and it stayed at 20 this year. Our housing trust fund went all the way up to 7.6. So upward movement, not great upward movement, but upward movement. So we take the wins where we can get them. But it is, this delegation is pretty crucial. So Senator Edwards, Senator Van Dyne, Representative Ager, talk to them regularly about the need. Make sure they know that this is something important, because the committee that this money runs through, it's called the General Government Committee, and the Workforce Housing Loan Program and the Housing Trust Fund, they're competing with my state agency needs a new copier, and oh look, here's the biggest pot of money is this thing over here. It's not a very specific committee like most other committees. So it's just kind of a general, and not a lot of folks spend a lot of time thinking about housing on the committee. But it's an easy pot of money to take something to make numbers work at another state agency. So it is absolutely crucial to keep in the front of folks' minds who are on that committee the need for affordable housing. The other thing I'll mention at the state level, 2 years ago, we had an attempt in the Senate budget to repeal the state's Fair Housing Act. So we have a state Fair Housing Act on top of the federal Fair Housing Act, which is amazing. One of the things that we have in North Carolina, though, that no other state in the nation has, is we have a protection for affordability in zoning decisions. You are not allowed to discriminate in zoning decisions against affordable housing. Only state in the nation that has it. And it is sometimes the only thing that gets some developments through a local zoning board. We've seen several cases of folks realizing that this law is on the books and know, well, we got to proceed on this. There was a run at that a couple of years ago, and we were able to beat it back, and I'm always keeping an eye out, but that's one thing I want to put in the back of your heads just in case you see from us something happening. I was on the phone with an accountant. I drove up with Mark Shelburne, and we were talking and he was trying to explain to us why it may actually increase LIHTC financing in a strange way, in a way that I don't fully understand yet, because he explained it in 10 minutes. The unknown. So for those of you who don't know, as soon as Donald Trump got elected, LIHTC, the prices that folks would pay for tax credits dropped precipitously, because everyone assumed that tax reform was going to get done. And no longer would all these folks who invest in affordable housing have the tax liability that would incentivize them to invest, right? And so for deals that had already been approved, but they hadn't yet gotten their financing, all of a sudden they were looking at six-figure gaps in their budget because the tax credit pricing dropped really quickly. So if none of you understood that, or if some of you didn't understand that, it's all right. It takes a while to get it. But there were these unintended impacts, right? So the question is kind of a live one, and there's some disagreement. Most people think that it is going to negatively impact. If we drop the corporate rate down from 35 to whatever it's going to be, 25 or 20, or President Trump wants 15, which is not going to happen. it's going to lower the incentive for corporations to invest in affordable housing, which means the pricing is going to drop, and there are going to be fewer dollars available for the credits. They aren't going to be worth as much. I think that's the prevailing wisdom. Someone gave me an argument on the drive over here that he was trying to make the case that it may actually help. But once again, we have a framework. We don't have a plan, so no one can crunch any numbers on this right now. So that's what we did last year, was we backfilled some of the 2016 deals with 2017 credits so that we could make the deals that were already approved work. I don't know, and I think it remains to be seen. The big conversation around the QAP this year is rising construction costs and what that's doing to... I was listening to the home builders the other day saying that the average age of a plumber in this country is like 61 years old. The average age for a carpenter is 62, and no one's like cycling up through the trades in the same way. And so a couple of years out, we're looking at some pretty scary construction cost numbers, and not just in terms of supplies, which I think the recent disasters are going to affect a lot of that pricing right now as well. But those costs are looking to continue to climb over the next little bit. Yeah, not recently. Not with any effect, but yeah. So one of the things that some cities and some states have attempted and been successful at, Baltimore most recently, is they have made it illegal to discriminate based on source of income. So I'm not able to say, oh, you have a voucher, I don't want to rent to you. I'm going to rent to the next person. Yeah, no, I hear, and I mean that's as a policy person, as the one who has to go out and try and convince people. We try and construct a lot of different arguments that are going to hit a lot of different audiences. We do our work from a place that housing is a basic human right. Right? You don't have to convince me of that. It's just a matter of convincing other folks that it is. It's the city of Baltimore. So here's the thing. So, and this is in the same, somewhat the same box as mandatory inclusionary zoning, right? Because we're a Dillon Rule state, and for those of you who haven't heard that term before, local governments derive all of their authority from state government. So if you don't have explicit permission from the state government to do something, you as a local government can't do it in North Carolina. So with mandatory inclusionary zoning, there are a couple of communities in North Carolina, Davidson, Manio, and Orange County, Chapel Hill, that have an inclusionary zoning ordinance. But so it's an open legal question as to whether or not you have the authority. I'm pretty sure if Asheville attempted it, which is, I think, this conversation's been happening in Asheville for a while now, so I don't need to tell you that it would be shot down, much in the same way. I don't want to talk about HB2 right now, but this was an example of the state preempting local power, which has been a trend for several years on a number of things, whether it was a community out east who banned fracking in there, and it's like, nope, you don't have the authority to do that. Or whether it's very restrictive minimum housing codes, nope, you don't have the authority to do that. Or whether it's living wage ordinances, right? Things like that have been continually preempted by the General Assembly, and my assumption is that if we tried to go for source of income discrimination, local laws, is that it would have a similar effect. I don't want to tell you whether that means you should not try. And I've been, the land use incentive policy that y'all put together, a lot of communities have tried some kind of form of voluntary inclusionary zoning, and it hasn't worked. Because, and I think most of that has been a result of they haven't sat down with developers to figure out what they actually need from a local government to truly incentivize them to do it. And it seems like for right now, it's a powerful tool, right? Is what we generally find with, and what we found in Wake County. Was that the whole purpose was we'll give you freedom, right? That was a big selling point of the Section 8 program. You freedom to roam, find your housing. But what we find is that the landlords that'll take those vouchers end up being in the same neighborhoods where we concentrated poverty before, and we end up with the same or really a worse result. because it's not as secure. Well, it's that and the necessary inspection that comes with a Section 8 voucher, right? Why would I wait 2 weeks for an inspector to show up when I've got 15 people who could take it right now? So it gets a little difficult. We could get in the weeds on a lot of these policy things, but what I want to most communicate to you right now is that, especially at the federal level, a lot is happening right now, even though it doesn't quite seem like a lot is happening right now. And now is the time to reach out to your folks. So once again, Meadows on the House side is incredibly influential in this process. And both of our senators, Senator Burr sits on the Finance Committee, which is where tax reform is going to be happening, and Senator Tillis now sits on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. So both of them are very, very crucial in the housing conversation. We also, in the state of North Carolina, if you operate outside of Asheville, Representative Holding is on Ways and Means, where the tax reform process is happening in the House. We've first North Carolina on Ways and Means since, I think, the 70s. And then we have several folks. David Price, Representative Price, is on the subcommittee that deals with HUD's budget, the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Committee. And we also have several folks on financial affairs. So we have a pretty crucial delegation in terms of the national affordable housing picture. All of the energy right now, all of the activism energy is on a whole lot of other issues at the moment, right? They're getting calls on healthcare, more calls than they want. I was sitting in Burr's office during the first time they tried to repeal, and just the wearied look on the folks whose responsibility it was to answer the phone was palpable, right? There are folks getting up over DACA, around the refugee ban, things like that. There's a lot of activism around that and a lot of focus on that. And even though I think each of us recognize that affordable housing pops up in our newspapers more than almost any other subject item, our national conversation around affordable housing is on nowhere near the same plane as a lot of these other things. They need to hear from us in volume. We're also, we're looking at the state level. We'll have a short session coming up next year, having a legislative day from the Housing Coalition and trying to bring the affordable housing field from around North Carolina to begin to make this a regular issue at the General Assembly. But please, call your folks. Any other questions? Yeah. All right. I think that's it for me. Once again, Samuel Gunter, North Carolina Housing Coalition. Please join us, and thank you all.